I'm Hannah Cole, 31, and the day my grandfather's will was read, the room smelled like polished wood and triumph that didn't belong to me. My father leaned back as if a crown had just been set on his head. My brother checked his watch like he had places grander to be, and I sat very still. So no one would see, my hands shake. The lawyer's voice rolled over a list of houses and land and numbers with too many zeros. Then he looked at me as if I were a footnote and placed a single rusted key in my palm. The laughter that followed was quiet, but it spread like a stain, and in that instant I understood exactly how small they expected me to remain. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever held something worthless in your hand that ended up meaning everything. I grew up on the edge of Chicago where bus routes stitched together our days and summer nights sounded like box fans and open windows. My mother kept a neat kitchen and a soft tone, and my grandfather Walter taught me to tighten a bolt and keep my word, because both were harder to undo once they slipped. He never made speeches about money. He just showed up with work gloves and a thermos, and he'd say that a person's name should be sturdier than any lock. My father talked about legacy at the club and made introductions that felt like auditions. My brother slid into that world like he was built for it, crisp shirts and quick smiles. And by the time we were adults, the distance between their dinners and my grocery list felt like a long road with no turnoffs. I rented a narrow room with a spider-webbed ceiling and woke at 6 to catch a crowded bus, while Brandon parked his car by a glass tower that reflected the lake like it belonged to him. In our family photographs, the light always seemed to find the men, my grandfather's broad shoulders and my father's practiced grin and my brother's easy confidence, and somewhere near the edge was me holding a paper cup, trying not to blink. I told myself it was fine, that quiet work was still work, that kindness counted, even if no one clapped for it. Walter never treated me like a background figure. He'd pat the space beside him on the porch swing and tell me the first step mattered most, not the size of the door you walked through, and when he grew older and his voice thinned, he still carried that steady look that made me sit up straighter without realizing it. The will reading was held in a downtown office where afternoon sun turned the windows into mirrors. Dennis Proctor cleared his throat. The room hummed with approval as my father received the estate and my brother took enough stock to build his own skyline. Cousins I rarely saw nodded over parcels of land they didn't know how to spell, and then silence landed on my name. Dennis slid the key across the table and said a garage in the West Side Industrial District, and for a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard him. The metal felt rough and cold against my skin, and my father's smile tightened as if the joke cost him nothing. Brandon let out a small bark of a laugh and apologized to no one. My mother's hand found mine under the table, her fingers cool, and she whispered that Walter never did anything without a reason. The room didn't argue with her. It simply moved on, pen scratches and chair legs and the soft thud of doors closing behind wealth that knew where it was going. I kept my eyes on the key until the edges printed little half-moons into my palm. Outside, the air was heavy and hot, and I walked the block twice to steady myself. A city bus hissed to a stop, and for a moment I thought about dropping the key into the nearest trash can and letting the lid close on the sound it would make. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket and felt it tug at the fabric like a weight I hadn't chosen. My grandfather's lessons traveled home with me on the bus, the steady rhythm of the route, and his voice layered over it. Not a sermon, just simple rules that had always seemed to fit. Return what you borrow. Admit when you're wrong. Give more than you take because you won't be able to carry it all anyway. I stared at the cracked paint above my bed and tried to decide whether the key meant an apology, a mistake, or a dare. By morning, the choice still sat there, waiting quiet and stubborn. I went to work and filed names I would never meet, answered phones with a smile. I saved for strangers, watched the clock tilt its face toward lunch, and then away again. And when I caught my reflection in the microwave door, I barely recognized the girl who used to ride shotgun in Walter's pickup with the windows down. At 5, the office lights turned the hallways pale, and I took the long way to the bus stop because walking felt like a plan. By dusk, the city bled into the industrial blocks, where old brick met chain link and wind threaded through empty loading docks. The sign above a heavy iron door was faded, but it held our last name, Cole. A stubborn stamp that hadn't peeled away, and I stood there long enough to hear my own breathing and the distant rattle of a train. The key was small in my hand, smaller than the hurt, smaller than the laughter. But when the lock turned and the door sighed open, the air that came out smelled like oil and dust and time, and I realized I was stepping into a room no one expected me to claim. What waited in that darkness would ask me a question my family never had, and I was almost ready to answer it. The air inside the garage was thick with dust and the faint bite of oil. My flashlight shook as I stepped forward, the beam catching on broken crates and rusted tools scattered across the cracked floor. The walls seemed to swallow sound, every step echoing back at me. I'd expected a pile of junk, but something about the quiet felt deliberate, as though the room were holding its breath. I called out my grandfather's name once softly, just to hear it fill the space, then let the silence close around me again. Near the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of wooden boxes, a smaller metal door caught the light. It didn't match the rest of the place. Its bolts were clean, its handle newer. I pushed the crates aside and found a small brass plate screwed above the lock. The engraving was faint, but still clear enough to make my throat tighten. It was my birthday. For a moment I couldn't move. The key in my pocket felt heavier than before. I brushed away the dust and ran my fingers over the numbers the way I used to trace my name into wet concrete as a child. My grandfather had left this door for me. Whatever waited on the other side, he'd meant for me to find it alone. The lock was an old combination dial, the kind I hadn't seen since high school lockers. I turned the wheel slowly, aligning the month, the day, the year, each click loud, in the dark. When the final number settled, a soft snap broke the silence. My breath caught. I pulled the handle, and the door creaked open to reveal a narrow stairway descending into shadow. A cold draft rose from below, carrying the scent of earth and metal. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it downward. I thought of turning back, of closing the door, and pretending I'd never seen it, but his voice drifted through memory. "Don't fear failure, Hannah. Fear standing still." So I took the first step. The staircase was steep, the concrete damp beneath my shoes. My shoulders brushed the walls as I moved. When I reached the bottom, the beam of light trembled across rows of shelving that shimmered gold. For a heartbeat, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Then the light steadied, and there they were, bars of gold stacked in perfect rows, each one reflecting a dull glow. I sank to my knees, the cold air biting my skin. I lifted one bar with both hands, the weight of it pulled hard on my wrists. I had seen wealth before at my father's estate in Brandon's glossy car, but never like this. It was overwhelming, silent, and absolute. At the center of the room sat an iron table. On it rested an envelope sealed with red wax. My name, written in my grandfather's shaky hand, curved across the front. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "If you're reading this, Hannah, you found the vault. What lies before you isn't meant to be kept. It's a test of faith and strength. Deliver each crate to the 5 addresses marked on the racks. This gold belongs to others. I trust you to finish what I began." His words blurred as I read them again, the paper trembling between my fingers. The gold wasn't mine. It was a burden he'd chosen for me. I sat on the cold floor and pressed the letter against my knees. The shelves gleamed in the half-light, daring me to disobey. For the first time in years, I had power in my hands more than my father or brother would ever imagine, and all I had to do was keep it. The idea pulsed in my mind like a drumbeat. No one would know if a single bar disappeared. No one would ever trace it back to me. I pictured myself walking into my office in a new suit, watching my co-workers' eyes widen. I pictured handing my father the deed to a mansion larger than his. The hunger that came with those thoughts scared me. I dropped the bar back onto the shelf, the clang echoing through the vault until the sound folded into silence. His voice came again, low and steady in memory. "Wealth isn't what you keep, Hannah. It's what you give away." I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until the sting eased. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The gold around me felt like both punishment and promise. I could have stayed there forever arguing with ghosts, but the air was growing colder and the letter lay open on the floor like a command. I gathered the papers, folded them carefully, and slipped them into my jacket pocket. By the time I climbed back to the surface, dawn had tinted the sky the color of ash. The city was quiet, only the faint hum of traffic in the distance. I locked the heavy door behind me and stood for a moment in the pale light. My grandfather's words still rang in my head. If this was a test, it had already begun. The temptation burned bright and insistent, but underneath it, I felt something steadier, a thread of purpose I couldn't name yet. I drove home with the window cracked, the key resting on the seat beside me, its edges catching the morning light. The next days blurred into a rhythm of work and waiting. I answered phones, filed forms, smiled when spoken to. At night, I dreamed of the vault. Sometimes I saw it empty, sometimes overflowing. The first address on the list was written on the back of the letter in ink that had begun to fade. I kept tracing the letters until I knew them by heart. When Friday came, I requested a week of unpaid leave. My supervisor barely looked up from her computer when she approved it. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline that evening, I'd borrowed a small delivery truck and parked it behind my building. The crates waited in the vault, each one heavier than it looked. As I drove back toward the industrial district, my hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white. Inside the garage, the air was cooler now, still carrying that faint scent of oil and thyme. I loaded the first crate into the truck, straining under the weight, my breath sharp in the dark. When the door finally clanged shut behind me, I stood for a moment, listening to the engine idle. The gold sat hidden beneath a canvas tarp, its presence almost alive. My heart pounded as I checked the address again, a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains 3 states away. I didn't know what waited for me there or why my grandfather had chosen that place. But the longer I stared at the paper, the more certain I felt that turning back wasn't an option. The highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of gray lined with snow still clinging to the shoulders. I drove through the night, stopping only for gas, afraid to leave the truck unattended. Each time someone looked my way at a rest stop, my stomach tightened. The crate behind me felt like both shield and target. By the third morning, the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks brushed with frost. The address led me down a narrow road flanked by pine trees until the tires crunched over gravel and stopped before a small cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. An old man stepped onto the porch, his back straight, despite the cane in his hand. "You must be Walter's granddaughter," he said before I could speak. His voice was thin but sure. "He told me one day you'd come." I carried the crate to him, the weight dragging at my arms. When I set it down, the corner of the tarp slipped, revealing the edge of gold. His eyes didn't widen. Instead, a deep sadness crossed his face. He ran a hand across the bars the way someone might touch the surface of a grave. "He saved my life once," the man said quietly. "Told me it was nothing. Guess this is how he kept his word." The wind rattled the porch rail, and for a moment neither of us spoke. When he looked at me again, his expression softened. "You've got his eyes," he said. "The kind that don't quit no matter how hard it gets." I nodded, unsure what to say, and stepped back into the cold. The air outside bit at my cheeks as I walked to the truck. I glanced once over my shoulder at the cabin, at the man still standing there, his hand resting on the crate, as if it were a memory made solid. I started the engine, the tires slipping slightly on the ice, and eased back onto the main road. The sky ahead was pale blue, the kind that promised snow by nightfall. My chest ached from the effort, from the weight I'd left behind, and the miles still waiting. The second address was tucked safely in my coat pocket, ink pressed deep into the paper. As the truck climbed the winding road, I caught a glimpse of the valley below and felt the faint pull of something I hadn't known in years resolve. The first delivery was done. The rest would test more than strength. They would test who I was when no one was watching. Snow followed me out of the Adirondacks' flurries, turning to slush, as I crossed into New York City traffic. The truck rattled beneath me, the tarp in back snapping against its ropes. I'd slept little in the last 2 nights, the hum of the road louder than my thoughts. When the skyline finally rose ahead, It looked sharper than I remembered, glass and steel pressed against a pale winter sky. I parked near the station, switched trucks for a freight compartment on an overnight train, and sat across from the next crate, watching my breath fog the window. The letter's second address led to Boston Harbor. My hands shook each time I unfolded the paper, the ink faded at the edges, where my thumb had traced the words too often. I carried the crate through the cold morning, the wheels of the handcart squealing on uneven pavement. The building matched the description, tall, mirrored, and almost silent, except for the sound of elevators gliding behind glass. At the front desk, I gave the receptionist a folded note with Walter Cole's signature and waited until she motioned me through a set of double doors. Inside, an office overlooked the harbor, water gray as pewter under the clouds. A man in his 60s rose from behind a wide desk. His suit was pressed, but his smile was gentle. "Charles Donovan," he said, extending his hand. "You look just like him around the eyes." I nodded and set the crate down. The lid came loose with a dull groan, and the light struck gold. Donovan exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a prayer. "That old man," he murmured, shaking his head, "always keeping his promises." He poured 2 glasses of water and gestured for me to sit. For a while he said nothing, only stared at the bars as though measuring time itself. "Your grandfather started in my father's shop," he said finally. "We used to joke that he could fix anything with a wrench and a story. But what made him different wasn't skill. It was how he treated people. He'd lose sleep to keep his word." Donovan opened a drawer and slid a small envelope toward me. "He left this here years ago, said it was for the one who delivered the second crate." I turned the envelope over. Inside was a single scrap of paper, my grandfather's handwriting, looping unevenly. "Keep your integrity. Hannah. Gold is secondary." The words blurred my eyes, stinging from fatigue or something near it. Donovan looked away, giving me space. When he spoke again, his tone softened. "He trusted you with more than money. Don't forget that." I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. The train back to New York was crowded, every seat taken. I kept my hands folded over the envelope, the hum of wheels against rails steady under my feet. Through the window, city lights appeared and vanished, reflected in the glass like ghosts. I wondered how many more deliveries waited, how many strangers would open their doors and see a piece of my grandfather's life staring back at them. Sleep came only in fragments, faces, roads, the flicker of headlights, and each time I woke, my heart pounded like I'd forgotten something vital. By the 4th morning, exhaustion blurred into routine. I refueled the truck, checked the tarp straps, and pointed south toward the desert. The 3rd address sat just outside Tucson near a patch of highway surrounded by low hills and mesquite trees. The sun there carried a different weight, the kind that pressed on skin and eyes alike. The nursing home appeared small against the wide horizon, its garden bright with winter flowers. I parked near the entrance, sweat already forming under my collar. Inside, cool air drifted through a narrow hallway, lined with faded photographs. A nurse with silver-streaked hair looked up from a clipboard. When I said my grandfather's name, her expression softened into something close to disbelief. "He never forgot us," she whispered, leading me toward a common room. Elderly residents sat in soft chairs, some asleep, some playing cards. When she announced that I'd come on Walter's behalf, the chatter stopped. An old man stood gripping the armrest for balance. He kept this place running when no one else would. He said, voice trembling, "Don't think we didn't know." I set the crate down beside him and lifted the lid. Light spilled over the dull gold surface. The nurse covered her mouth, her eyes wet. "He wanted you to have what you needed," I said quietly. That was his wish. The room filled with murmurs, half awe, half gratitude, and for a moment I felt the air change heavier, yet somehow kind. They insisted I stay for dinner. The meal was simple stew, mashed potatoes, a slice of pie shared among 6 people at my table. Laughter drifted across the room, soft and real. Someone told a story about my grandfather delivering food during a storm years ago, boots soaked through smile, easy as if he belonged there. I listened until the noise in my head quieted. By the time I stepped outside, twilight had spread over the desert, the horizon lined in gold that wasn't made of metal. I slept in the truck that night, parked beside the fence where crickets sang in the brush. The note from Donovan lay beside me on the passenger seat. I read it once more, then folded it against my chest. When morning came, the sky was pale and empty. The road back to Chicago stretched ahead long and quiet. The miles gave me too much time to think. With each crate gone, the truck grew lighter, but my shoulders didn't. The temptation still lingered how easy it would be to keep what was left, how no one would ever know. Yet each face I'd seen, each story shared, dulled that thought until it sounded hollow. The gold had weight, but the gratitude I'd witnessed carried more. By the time I reached Illinois, rain was falling hard, streaking the windshield, until the world outside blurred. The wipers beat a steady rhythm as I followed the last address on the list, a downtown building marked Northlight Foundation. I knew I wasn't ready for whatever waited there, but the letter in my coat left no room for hesitation. My grandfather had trusted me with this final step, and somewhere between the storm and the city lights, I began to trust myself enough to take it. The tires splashed through puddles as I turned down the narrow street leading into Chicago's heart. Ahead, glass towers rose through mist, their reflections trembling on the wet pavement. I tightened my grip on the wheel, feeling the pull between exhaustion and resolve. One more delivery, one last promise, and the silence that would follow it. Rain thickened into a steady curtain as I crossed the bridge into downtown Chicago. Headlights shimmered against the slick pavement, and the wipers beat a tired rhythm on the windshield. The city looked different through the storm, less like home, more like something testing my resolve. The truck felt lighter than before, but the air inside it carried the same tension I'd been driving with for weeks. Only one crate remained. The address on the final envelope led to a tower of glass and steel that cut into the clouds. Northlight Foundation, the sign read in brushed metal letters. I parked beneath a row of dripping trees and sat for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel. Inside the cab, the gold sat beneath a tarp, silent and accusing. The building loomed, cold light spilling through its windows, and for a brief second I wondered what my grandfather had seen in these walls. A security guard opened the door as I approached, rain dripping from the hem of my coat. He led me through a lobby lined with photographs, smiling children hospital wards, rows of volunteers with shovels and hard hats. Behind the reception desk, a woman glanced up when I mentioned Walter Cole's name. Her face changed in an instant. "Please wait," she said, and disappeared through a side door. Minutes later, she returned. "Mr. Hale will see you now." The elevator rose quietly. When the doors opened, a man stood beside a large window overlooking the city. Robert Hale, tall and deliberate in his movements, turned as I entered. His eyes softened when I introduced myself. "Your grandfather was one of our founders," he said, "though you wouldn't know it. He never let us put his name on anything." I told him I'd been asked to deliver something. Together we opened the crate. The light caught the gold and filled the office with a faint reflection that danced along the glass walls. Hale stared at it without speaking for a long time. Then he crossed to a shelf and pulled down a worn folder. Inside were letters, photographs, and receipts stamped with the foundation's seal. Every school, every hospital wing, every disaster fund, we found his signature in the margins. Anonymous donations year after year. He handed me a photograph of a group of nurses standing outside a rural clinic. The plaque above the door read, "Cole Community Health Center." "He built all of this quietly," Hale said, voice low. When I asked him once why he refused recognition, he said, "Real giving didn't leave fingerprints." The words struck something inside me. My grandfather had never spoken of these things. He'd built an entire life of service behind closed doors. Hale rested his hand on the crate and looked at me with a kind of quiet understanding. "You've brought the final piece," he said. "Not gold, Miss Cole. Legacy." His voice wavered slightly on the last word. I nodded, unable to speak, and helped him close the lid. The rain against the window softened to a hush. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, turning the wet city gold. When I stepped back into the night, the drizzle had thinned to a mist. Cars rolled past in streaks of white light, and my reflection wavered in every puddle I crossed. I made it to the truck before the first tear slid down my cheek. I didn't fight it. The exhaustion, the fear, the weight of weeks spent in motion, all of it folded into one soundless release. For years, I had been measured against people who only took, yet here I was, finishing the work of someone who had given everything away. The drive to the industrial district blurred through my tears. The streets were nearly empty when I reached the garage. The iron door groaned as it opened, echoing through the hollow space. I left the truck running for light and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old oil, the same as the first night. Only this time the shelves were bare. The vault below lay still, the gold replaced by shadows. I walked down the steps until my feet touched the concrete floor. My flashlight beam caught the faint marks where the crates had sat. The emptiness pressed around me like a living thing. I sank down onto the cold ground, my back against the wall. I did it. I whispered, the sound barely reaching my own ears. It's gone. All of it. The silence answered. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the pause after a heartbeat. The tears came again, slower this time, until the concrete beneath me was damp. For so long I had chased the idea of proving myself, of showing my father, my brother, everyone that I was more than the girl who answered phones. Yet now, after all the miles and every ounce of strength spent, I had nothing to show. No fortune, no proof. Just an empty vault and the echo of a promise kept. Lightning flashed through the cracks above, lighting the room in white. I pressed my forehead against my knees. "You asked me to be strong," I whispered, my voice cracking. "But I'm still the same. I'm still nothing." The words hung in the air, raw and sharp. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling through the walls. At some point, exhaustion pulled me down into half-sleep. I don't know how long I sat there before a sound above broke the silence, a slow creak, then footsteps descending the stairs. I straightened, heart pounding. A figure appeared at the edge of the light, tall, dressed in a dark coat. Hannah Cole. His voice was calm, deep familiar in its certainty. "My name is Alan Reeves. I was your grandfather's private attorney." He stepped closer, the beam from my flashlight catching streaks of silver in his hair. "He asked me to come when your work was done." I pushed myself to my feet, leaning against the wall for balance. "How did you know I'd be here?" "This place was fitted with a silent alarm," he said simply. "It signaled the moment the vault emptied. I've been waiting for that call." He set a leather briefcase on the table and unlatched it. Inside was a sealed envelope marked with a wax insignia I recognized instantly, my grandfather's initials. Reeves slid it toward me. He left instructions for this to be opened only after the deliveries were complete. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. The letter inside was written in the same uneven hand as the first one, but the ink was darker, fresher. "If you're reading this, Hannah, you did what I hoped. You chose compassion over pride. The gold was never meant to be your inheritance. It was meant to show you that strength isn't in what we keep, but in what we can let go. Now you are ready for what comes next." When I looked up, Reeves was already placing a stack of documents on the table: bank statements, deeds, certificates. "Your grandfather established a trust," he said. $10 million transferred to your name as of this hour. He wanted you to inherit not only his wealth, but his understanding of it." The air left my lungs in a shudder. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the rain outside and the quiet hum of the truck engine still running above us. Reeves closed the briefcase. "He was proud of you, Hannah," he said softly. "He believed you'd find your own way here." I folded the letter against my chest. The paper felt warm from my hands, as if it carried the last of his heartbeat. When I finally climbed the stairs, the rain had stopped. The night air was cool and clear, the streetlights glinting off puddles like scattered coins. Behind me, the garage stood silent once more, an empty shell that had given back everything it took. Ahead, the city stretched wide and alive. I stood there for a while, the wind brushing against my face until the first hint of dawn touched the sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel forgotten. Somewhere between the loss and the lesson my grandfather had given me, something none of them ever could, the quiet certainty of worth. I turned the key one last time, locking the door behind me. Tomorrow I would decide what to do with what he'd left. But tonight I just wanted to breathe, to stand under that fragile bit of morning light and let it remind me that starting over could feel like being seen. The next morning broke with pale lights spilling across the city. I barely slept. The letter from my grandfather lay open on the nightstand, its ink pressed deep into the paper, like he'd written it slowly, with thought behind every word. $10 million. Even seeing it written out on the documents Alan Reeves had handed me didn't make it feel real. It wasn't the money that kept me awake, it was what it meant. I had spent weeks hauling gold through snow and storms, handing away fortune after fortune. And now, after giving everything up, I had inherited more than I ever imagined. When I arrived at Alan's office that afternoon, the rain had turned to a thin mist. He greeted me with that calm, unhurried voice that always carried authority. "Your grandfather left clear instructions," he said, gesturing toward a thick binder on his desk. "You're the executor of his personal trust. No one else in your family has claim to it." He paused, meeting my eyes. He wanted to ensure you'd never have to depend on anyone again. The words sank in slowly. I traced the edges of the binder, thinking of my father's smirk the day of the will reading. "So, they don't know," I said quietly. Alan shook his head. "Only Walter, myself, and now you." He leaned back in his chair. He always said understanding worth must come before wealth. By the time I left, the fog had thickened around the riverfront. The city looked softer, muted, as though the world was giving me a moment to breathe. For the first time, I didn't feel like running. I found a diner on this corner and sat by the window stirring sugar into a cup of coffee, gone cold before I ever tasted it. The reflection in the glass didn't look like the woman who had walked into the garage weeks ago. I still wore the same coat, the same scuffed boots, but something in my face had changed. That evening I called my mother. It had been months since we'd spoken beyond short, polite messages. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Hannah." I heard clinking dishes in the background. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "I just wanted to check on you." There was a pause long enough to carry meaning. "Your father's been busy," she said carefully. "Brandon, too. I think they've been expecting to hear from you." I knew what that meant. They were curious about the garage, the inheritance, whether the humiliation had been enough to drive me away for good. "Tell them I'm doing well," I said, "and that Grandpa's gift wasn't what they thought." She hesitated. Was it worth it? I looked out the window, watching streetlights blink through the rain. More than they'll ever know. When I hung up, the weight that had been pressing against my chest eased a little. My mother had always tried to keep the family from breaking apart, patching over the cracks no one else wanted to see. Maybe this time I'd let her rest. The next few weeks passed quietly. I stayed at my small apartment, still taking the bus to work even though I didn't have to. The trust papers sat locked in my drawer. Every morning, I reminded myself of what my grandfather had written. Don't measure your worth by what you keep. Measure it by what you can build. One evening, Alan called with another request from the trust. "Walter wanted you to visit the estate one last time," he said. "There's a letter in the study. He left it sealed, but I'm authorized to tell you where to find it." Driving up the long road to my father's house felt like retracing an old scar. The iron gate opened with a slow groan, and the lights inside glowed warm against the evening fog. My father was on the porch talking on his phone. When he saw me, surprise flickered across his face. "Well, he said hanging up if it isn't our heiress of the garage." His tone carried that same edge it always did, somewhere between sarcasm and resentment. "I just came to pick up something Grandpa left," I said. "In the study," he asked, narrowing his eyes. "I thought the lawyers cleared all that out. They missed a letter." I replied. "Alan Reeves told me where it would be." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Of course he did." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go ahead. Just don't take the furniture with you." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The study was just as I remembered, lined with shelves, a globe in the corner, and my grandfather's desk still polished to a shine. I found the letter in the top drawer, sealed in red wax. The handwriting was unmistakable. I held it for a long moment before slipping it into my coat pocket. My father lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. "You know," he said slowly, "your brother's had some bad luck at the firm. Clients are pulling out, things are tight." He looked at me the way he used to when asking for something without saying it directly. "If there's anything in that garage worth selling, it would help the family." I met his eyes. "There isn't," I said evenly. His mouth tightened. "You're really going to let us struggle while you cling to that scrap of rust?" I walked past him toward the front door. "It's not mine to sell." Behind me, his voice rose. "You've always been selfish, Hannah. Even now, when you finally have something, you hide it away." I paused at the threshold. Maybe I'm just not hiding it for you. Then I stepped out into the cold air, the door closing behind me with a sound that felt final. At home, I opened the letter. Inside was a single line written in my grandfather's careful hand. "When the noise gets too loud, remember who taught you to listen." Underneath it lay a small brass key with a tag labeled Lakeview Office. The address belonged to an old storefront downtown, one I remembered passing every morning on the bus. The next day, I used the key. The door opened into a quiet office, its walls lined with files and photographs of hospitals, schools, and projects funded by the foundation. On the desk sat another envelope, this one addressed to me in newer ink. Inside was a trust authorization form already signed by Alan Reeves, granting me co-directorship of the Walter Cole Foundation. For a long moment, I stood in that empty office, the hum of the city faint through the glass. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about continuing something that had started long before I was born. My grandfather hadn't built his legacy for recognition. He'd built it to keep others standing. Now it was mine to carry forward. When I left the building, the wind off the lake was sharp but clean. The traffic lights blinked green, and the sidewalks glistened from a fresh drizzle. I walked past the bus stop, past the corner, where I used to wait every morning. Tomorrow, everything would look the same to the world, but for me, everything had changed. As I reached the crosswalk, the light shifted, and I caught my reflection in a shop window. For the first time, I didn't see the girl who had been handed a rusted key in a room full of laughter. I saw someone who had turned that insult into purpose. The letter, the trust, the foundation, all of it had brought me here. Yet I knew this wasn't the end. My family wouldn't stay silent for long, and neither would the world that once overlooked me. But now I had something stronger than proof. I had direction. I crossed the street as the city lights brightened behind me, each one reflected in the wet pavement like a path stretching forward. Whatever came next, I was ready to meet it. The first months at the foundation moved quietly. I spent most mornings at the Lakeview office, unlocking the door before sunrise, breathing in the stillness before the phone started ringing. The air always carried a trace of dust and paper, like the scent of a library left untouched. Each day, new letters arrived, requests for grants proposals, for clinics, handwritten notes from people who had known my grandfather. Reading them became a ritual. Some letters spoke of gratitude, others of need, and all carried the same thread of trust in his name. Alan Reeves visited once a week to guide me through the transition. He never hurried explaining every document like a teacher who'd seen too many people forget what mattered. "The money is a tool," he said one afternoon, adjusting his glasses. "But the intent, that's what gives it meaning. Don't lose that." I nodded, though part of me still felt like an imposter behind the desk that once belonged to him. One morning, I met Emma Rivera, the communications director, who had managed Walter's correspondence for years. She was warm but direct, the kind of person who could make a room settle with a few calm words. He believed in quiet giving, she told me, as we sorted through old files. Most people didn't even know he was behind half the projects we funded, but he always said you'd understand why someday. Her words stayed with me long after she left my office. By early spring, the Foundation's annual report was due. Emma suggested we host a small gathering for the staff. Nothing public, just a private evening to honor the work my grandfather had started. I agreed, though the thought of speaking made my stomach tighten. The event was held in the same hall where he'd once signed the first partnership contracts. The room was modest, flowers on each table, framed photos of finished schools and clinics lining the walls. When I stepped up to the podium, my hands trembled against the papers I didn't need. I never knew everything my grandfather built, I began, but I've seen the difference he made. It's our job now to keep that going. The words came out steadier than I expected. The staff clapped softly, their faces kind. For the first time, I felt not just like his granddaughter, but like the person he'd hoped I could be. But outside that room, the world was already stirring. 2 days later, a message appeared in my inbox from my brother Brandon. "We need to talk." The subject line alone carried the weight of every unfinished argument between us. I called him that evening, and his voice came through sharp, impatient. Dad found out about the trust, he said without greeting. He's furious. He says you're hiding money that should belong to the family. I pressed my hand to my forehead. It's not theirs, Brandon. It never was. That's not how he sees it. You need to come home and explain yourself before this gets worse. There was a pause on the line filled with the sound of his exhale. Look, he said, finally softer. I don't care about the money, not really. But Dad's not letting this go. When I arrived at my parents' house, the lights from the living room spilled out onto the porch. My mother met me at the door, worry lining her face. He's been pacing all day, she whispered. Please, just keep calm. Inside, my father stood by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. So he said without turning. The garage wasn't junk after all. His voice was quiet, too even. $10 million. While the rest of us got property taxes and upkeep bills. It wasn't meant for you, I said carefully. It was Grandpa's choice. You know that. He faced me, then eyes cold. He built everything with my help. You think he did it alone? And now his fortune goes to you, the one person who's done nothing for it. The words landed like small stones. I kept my voice low. I didn't ask for it. I just followed what he left. Brandon stepped forward, trying to ease the tension. Dad, this isn't helping, Thomas cut him off with a glare. Stay out of it. You've already failed to keep her in check. His attention turned back to me. You're going to transfer the funds. Half to me, half to your brother. That's what a fair family would do. I met his stare. Grandpa trusted me to use it the right way. I won't betray that. He slammed his glass onto the mantel, the sound sharp against the quiet. You always were his favorite, he said bitterly. He saw you as some reflection of himself. But you're not him, Hannah. You never will be. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire cracking in the hearth. My mother's eyes glistened as she reached for his arm, but he pulled away. I turned toward the door, my hands shaking only slightly. I'm sorry you see it that way, I said. But I'm done proving myself. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. I walked to my car, hearing Brandon call after me, but I didn't stop. The driveway lights blurred through tears I didn't want him to see. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn their respect, and now I finally understood it wasn't mine to earn. Back in the city, I went straight to the foundation office. The building was dark except for the small lamp in my office window. I sat at my desk until the shaking in my hands faded. On the wall hung a framed photo from the event a week earlier, me at the podium, Emma clapping in the corner, smiles around the room. It looked like belonging something I'd never had in my own family. I pulled out my grandfather's last letter and read it again. You chose compassion over pride. Now you are ready for what comes next. The words didn't feel like comfort anymore. They felt like instruction. The next morning I called Alan. If the family tries to contest the trust, what happens? He sighed. They'll fail. Walter's estate is airtight. But it might get ugly, Hannah. Are you sure you want to fight it? I'm not fighting, I said. I'm protecting what he built. Alan hesitated, then said quietly, That's exactly what he hoped you'd say. The days that followed brought silence from my father, though the quiet didn't feel like peace. Brandon texted once a short message that read, He's angry, but he'll come around. I didn't answer. The space between us had become something that words couldn't close. By the end of the week, Emma stopped by my office with a small box. Your grandfather's old nameplate, she said. We found it in storage. Thought you might want it. The brass had tarnished, but the letters were still clear, Walter Cole, founder. I ran my thumb across the surface and smiled faintly. I placed the plate on my desk beside the new one that read, Hannah Cole, Director. The two names caught the afternoon light together, reflections blending into one. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in his shadow. I felt like I was standing beside him. Outside, the city buzzed with the pulse of late spring horns, footsteps, and the hum of trains passing over the river. I stood by the window, watching it all, knowing that the peace wouldn't last. My father's pride had been bruised, and my brother's silence carried its own weight. But even as the storm built again, I felt grounded. Spring shifted toward early summer before my father made his next move. For weeks, I'd heard nothing, though silence from him never meant peace. The call came one afternoon while I was reviewing new scholarship applications with Emma. Alan Reeves' name flashed across my phone. His voice, steady but tense, left little room for doubt. "Your father has filed a formal challenge against the trust. He's claiming misappropriation and undue influence. We'll need to prepare a defense." The words landed like cold metal in my stomach. "Can he really do that?" I asked. "He can try," Alan said, "but the evidence is against him. Still, these things can get messy, public even." By the time I hung up, Emma had already read my face. "Trouble?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "My father's trying to take the foundation apart." Her brow furrowed. "Then it sounds like we're about to show him what it stands for." The next morning, the foundation's boardroom filled with papers, legal drafts, and the soft click of pens. Alan arrived early, carrying a briefcase thick with files. He set them down and looked at me across the table. "This isn't about the money, Hannah. It's about control. He wants to force you back into the role he understands obedience." I understood too well. For years, control had been his language. Even now, he was using it like a final command. "Then we'll answer with facts," I said, and with everything my grandfather left to prove him wrong. The first hearing was held 2 weeks later in a downtown courthouse. The corridors smelled faintly of polished marble and coffee gone cold. My father arrived in a dark suit, Brandon just behind him. He didn't look at me when I passed. Margaret stood beside him, quiet and pale. When the judge entered the room, settled into silence. My father's lawyer, someone I didn't recognize, stood first. "We intend to demonstrate," he said, "that Miss Cole unduly benefited from her grandfather's mental decline, assuming control of assets not meant for her." His voice carried confidence, but underneath it something wavered. Alan rose next. "Your Honor," he began, calm and deliberate, "Walter Cole established this trust long before any question of health. Every document is dated, notarized, and independently witnessed. The intent was crystal clear. His granddaughter Hannah was to continue his philanthropic work unrestricted." The day stretched on under fluorescent lights, each statement carving through the air like a blade. My father kept his eyes fixed on the table, but when I glanced at him, I caught the faint tremor in his jaw. Brandon sat rigid beside him, his expression unreadable. When it was my turn to testify, my hands tightened around the wooden railing of the stand. Alan's questions were steady, guiding me through the story, the key, the garage, the gold, the letters. Each detail filled the room until even the judge leaned forward slightly. When I described the deliveries, the veterans, the care home, the foundation, silence followed. Then Alan held up the final letter, the one with my grandfather's last words. "You chose compassion over pride." My father's lawyer objected, but the judge waved him off. "Continue," she said. Alan finished with a single question. "Miss Cole, in your view, what was your grandfather's purpose in structuring his estate this way?" I met his eyes. "To remind us that wealth only matters if it serves others," I said softly, "and that no amount of power replaces integrity." For the first time since the proceedings began, my father looked up. His expression wasn't anger, it was disbelief, as though he no longer recognized the daughter standing across from him. The hearing ended just past sunset. Reporters had gathered outside the courthouse, their microphones glinting in the light. I kept my head down, walking past them with Alan at my side. Behind me, my father's voice rose above the questions. She manipulated him. He wasn't thinking straight. Cameras flashed, catching every word. I didn't turn around. The following morning, the foundation's phone rang non-stop. Emma and the staff fielded calls from donors, journalists, and curious onlookers. "It's spreading fast," she said, sliding a newspaper across my desk. The front page showed my father leaving the courthouse, his expression fierce, under the headline, "Family Feud Over Philanthropic Fortune." I traced the headline with my thumb, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation. For years, that family name had meant power. Now it was a spectacle. "We'll stay focused on the work," I said. Alan's call came later that evening. "The judge ruled on the preliminary motion," he said. "Your father's claim has been dismissed. The trust stands as written." The breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped in a long exhale. "So it's over." "For now," Alan replied. "But public opinion has a way of leaving bruises. Be prepared." He was right. Over the next week, my father's anger turned outward interview statements, small jabs wrapped in politeness. Brandon called once, his tone weary. "He won't stop, Hannah. He says you've ruined the family's reputation." "I didn't ruin it," I said quietly. "I just stopped pretending it was perfect." The line was silent for a moment before he sighed. Maybe that's what scares him. That night, I sat alone in the office, the city lights flickering across the lake. On my desk lay the Foundation's next project proposal, a community scholarship for students from low-income families. It was the kind of program my grandfather would have approved of, simple and lasting. I signed the final authorization, sealing it with the Foundation's embossed mark. When I left the hallway, lights glowed soft and golden, catching the nameplate beside my door, Hannah Cole, Director. I paused, tracing the letters with my fingertip. The sound of footsteps made me turn. Emma stood in the doorway, her coat draped over one arm. "Long day?" she asked. "Long month," I said, half smiling. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You know he'd be proud of you. Not for the victory, though you earned it, but for what you didn't let it turn you into." I looked back at the city skyline, the reflection of the light stretching across the water. "Maybe that's enough," I said. When I walked outside, the air was warm, carrying the faint smell of rain on concrete. The courthouse battle, the headlines, the strain, they all seemed to fade behind me. My grandfather's words still lingered in my mind, the echo of his faith steady against the noise. The next day, a letter arrived at the Foundation addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside, there was no apology, just a few clipped sentences acknowledging the court's decision and wishing me luck in managing the burden. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the drawer beside my grandfather's first note, and closed it. Some endings didn't need confrontation. Summer had just begun. The days stretched long and bright, the city hummed softer in the heat. The Foundation's work pressed forward, new schools, clinics, scholarships, all of it, carrying Walter's name quietly without fanfare. And though my family's voices had grown distant, their echoes no longer decided my worth. Still, I knew this story wasn't finished. My father's silence felt temporary, like the pause before another storm. But for now, I had my footing, my purpose, and the legacy I was meant to protect. Summer slipped into autumn before I realized how much life had changed. The noise from the courthouse had faded, the reporters had moved on, and the Foundation settled into its rhythm. Each morning, I unlocked the Lakeview office and opened the blinds to let the light in. The city outside moved as it always had, but inside the air felt different, steady, purposeful, calm. My grandfather's presence lingered in small ways, his framed photograph by the door, the faint scent of old leather from his chair, the lessons tucked into every decision I made. My father never spoke to me again after the letter, though I heard through Brandon that the estate had suffered losses. Contracts fell through, investors backed out, and the family name, once so polished, carried a quiet shadow. My mother reached out, sometimes short calls about the weather or to ask if I was eating well. Her voice carried both worry and relief, like someone who had finally stopped choosing sides. Brandon's tone softened too. He came by one afternoon with his son just to see the Foundation's work. Watching him walk through the office, reading the plaques and project plans, I saw something lift from his expression. When he turned to me, there was no competition left in his eyes, only a kind of understanding that had taken years to find. The Foundation grew faster than I expected. Emma and I traveled to the first school we funded in rural Illinois, a small brick building surrounded by open fields. Children ran across the yard with books clutched to their chests, their laughter sharp and bright in the morning air. The principal shook my hand, eyes shining, and said, "Your grandfather helped us once long ago. Now his work has come back around." I looked at the children and thought how right he was. What began with a rusted key and a locked garage had turned into something alive, something that would outlast every argument and bruise my family left behind. When we returned to Chicago, Alan stopped by with new papers to sign. He was older now, moving slower, but his mind was still sharp. "You've done what Walter hoped," he said, setting the folder on my desk. "He wanted you to find your own way to carry his name forward, and you did." He smiled, faint but proud. He once told me legacy wasn't about who remembers you, but how many people get to move forward because you did the right thing. I didn't have an answer, only a quiet sense that he was right. The gold was long gone, but what it had built, the homes, the schools, the hope was worth more than any vault could hold. My grandfather had trusted me with a test, and somewhere between the temptation and the exhaustion, I had become the person he must have seen all along. That winter, I drove out to the countryside where he'd been buried. The ground was dusted with snow, the sky pale and still. I brushed the frost from his headstone and placed a single brass key on top of it, the one that had started everything. "You were right," I said softly. "It was never about what I found. It was about who I became." The wind picked up through the trees, gentle and low, and I let it carry the words wherever they needed to go. I stayed until the sun began to set, the light catching on the key, before fading into the horizon. When I finally turned back toward the car, I felt lighter, as if I had left the last of the weight behind. The city waited miles ahead, filled with faces and stories still unfolding. I knew there would be more challenges, more choices to make, but now they no longer frightened me. Looking back, I can see that justice didn't come from wealth or winning an argument. It came from learning the difference between being right and doing right. My grandfather taught me that dignity isn't inherited. It's earned through the quiet courage to stay kind in a world that isn't. And if you've ever been told you were nothing or that you didn't deserve the life you built, remember this. You don't have to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Just live it day by day in the way you treat others and the way you carry yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it found its way to you at the right time, maybe share it with someone who needs that reminder too, and don't forget to follow for more stories like this one.